Hey, Rosie.
Hi, Steve. So, in the last video, we looked at the Crusades, what they were and why people went on them. But now we're going to ask the question, what happened as a result of the Crusades? What changed and what were the impacts?
Yeah, and it's a really good question to ask because when we look at our timeline, we see these were conflicts that went on for several centuries. So something must have happened as a result of these conflicts. We saw that the Crusader states that they established in the Near East didn't last that long, but there were some other impacts that did have some profound effects on Europe itself.
So, how does this picture kind of help us understand what some of those impacts were?
Yeah, so the picture we have here is a Psalter map. That just means it comes from a book of Psalms. It's an image from that book. And this one was produced sometime in the mid 13th century in England, actually. And what we see in the map is what's called a T map pattern. So if you look at the map, it's laid out as a T here. And if you are getting an orientation of this, the vertical bar would be the Mediterranean Sea. So that there would be the Mediterranean Sea here, but going from west at the bottom to east at the top. And then we have Asia in this quadrant, Europe in this one, and Africa in this one. And so this was a fairly typical map layout for the several centuries right before the Crusades and after the Crusades. But what changed because of the Crusades was a subtle practice, but it tells us a lot about how Europeans were thinking, probably because of the influence of the Crusades. And that is that at the center of the map, they began to put the city of Jerusalem.
So we know that Jerusalem is an important city as a holy site and that it's part of the reason why the Crusades are launched in the first place. But it doesn't become this central location in the middle of the map as sort of the heart of the world until the Crusades have been going on for quite a while.
Right. So what changes here is the way the Christians in Europe are thinking about Jerusalem's role in their Christian faith and making it central to their thinking, literally by putting it at the center of these maps. But the impacts of the Crusades weren't entirely religious. There were also economic results of these interactions, of the traveling of these armies.
Right, so we see the rise of some big trading cities like Pisa, Genoa, and Venice, which are concentrated up in northern Italy.
So one of the things that these cities were doing, they had lots of ships. They were doing a lot of maritime, that is seagoing trade, and they assisted the Crusaders both in terms of transporting some of them physically over to the Near East and also in terms of bringing them supplies to continue to wage war. And this picture we have is actually of Dagobert of Pisa from the city of Pisa in Italy, who is going over to Jerusalem, and he becomes the first patriarch of Jerusalem once it falls under Christian control, which kind of indicates the importance of these Italian city-states in helping the Crusaders, that they would give one of these Pisans such an important role in the new kingdom. So the creation of these Crusader states encourages more interaction with Europeans and places that are physically beyond Europe. But we also want to look at how did the Crusades lead to different changes within Europe itself. And one of the biggest reactions that we see within Europe and from the Catholic Church is a response to heresy. Heresy is referring to a Christian belief that is not in line with orthodoxy, that is considered incorrect by the church. So it's important to distinguish between pagans, who were people who were not at all Christians, although there were crusades against the pagans in various places, and heretics, who were Christians who the church thought had wrong beliefs. So leaders in the church realized that they had these heretics in Europe, people who were professing unorthodox beliefs about Christianity, and they had this tool in crusading, in offering the Pope's blessing and the remission of sins for certain military actions in service of the church, that they could use to combat heresy within Europe itself. But beyond that, we also see the creation of what are called mendicant orders. That is, these are groups of monks, of friars, who take vows of poverty, and rather than living in monasteries, they go out among people and preach what is deemed the proper belief to try and help people have that right belief in the eyes of the church. And two of the major orders that are established very early in the 1200s because of this are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And we have a picture of St. Dominic here on the right, who founded the Dominican order. Another reaction from the church is more of a legal one, and that's the Inquisition. And Inquisition essentially means questioning, but it was the church questioning potential heretics to make sure that they had proper beliefs. So in response to these heretics, we see the church not only have the Inquisition and the creation of these mendicant orders to try and preach orthodoxy, we also do see crusades against heretical groups that can't be convinced to change their beliefs. And we have a major one here in the early 13th century against the Cathars in southern France. And we also have a crusade against the Bosnians, and then another one here later on in the 13th century against the Kingdom of Aragon because of a dispute between the leader and the Pope. And on top of that, in blue, we also see some crusades against pagan groups. And again, pagans were non-Christians, and attempts to convert them to Christianity oftentimes were turned into crusades. And we see a couple sort of corresponding with the Second Crusade back here against the Wends specifically, and then some up in Sweden. And then later on, we see some much longer lasting in blue crusades in the Baltic region here against the Livonians, the Lithuanians, and the Prussians, all of whom were non-Christian groups of people.
So all of this centuries of conflict led to basically the fact that the Crusaders and the Christians had some pretty strained relationships with a lot of these groups that they were fighting against.
Right, and probably the best example of this strange relationship is the Fourth Crusade, which occurs here between 1201 and 1204, and actually ends with the Venetians, the group from Venice, and the Crusaders accompanying them, sacking the city of Constantinople here, which is the Byzantine capital, which is a Christian empire, should be their allies, and they're supposed to be attacking Jerusalem. But what happened, short story, was that the Venetians were worried that they weren't going to get paid for their work transporting the Crusaders, and decided to make sure they did by redirecting the crusade against the relatively rich city of Constantinople.
So in addition to the conflict between Byzantine Christians and Western Christians, we also see centuries of conflict between Christians and Muslims. Even before the First Crusade, starting in about the 8th century, and then lasting until after the Crusades are over, we see a lot of conflict between Christians and Muslims, especially in Spain, as Christian kingdoms attempt to take over land in Spain.
Right, and this process that lasts for many, many centuries is what's called the Reconquista in Spanish, the Reconquest in English. And as you mentioned, Rosie, this fighting was going on before the First Crusade was ever called, but this conflict in Spain gets sort of rolled into the Crusades, and the Pope decides to grant Christians fighting against Muslims in Spain the same indulgences, the remission of sins that he grants to those Crusaders who are trying to recapture Jerusalem or other important Christian areas. But I think Spain also gives us one of the most interesting effects of this long-term conflict between Christians and Muslims, in that these centuries of fighting also lead to centuries of interaction.
We see a golden age of Islam where Muslim scholars are translating works from Greek into Arabic. And then we also see a lot of really fascinating medical, scientific, and mathematical breakthroughs. Here is an example of some algebra mathematical formulas that Al-Khwarizmi, a mathematical scholar, discovered during this time. So what we see with all of these interactions between Muslims and Christians was that eventually some of this knowledge gets transferred to Europe.
So we see a lot of this knowledge that was originally created by the Greeks and by the Romans that got lost to Europe, coming back to Europe because of the expansive interactions that Europeans have, in part due to crusading. And we also see some of the original ideas that came from these Muslim scholars in the meantime also making their way into Europe as well.
So even though the Crusades were initially motivated by military and religious reasons, they ended up having a lot of cultural and economic impacts as well. And we see that through a lot of these things that changed in Europe during and after the time of the Crusades.